Assistiremos agora a um vídeo introdutório da próxima palestra.
The University of Salamanca had a strong influence in most of Europe and in the Americas. The English hierarchy in 1510 and the Irish in 1591 began sponsoring colleges in Salamanca for the training of priests and hierarchy. By 1584, Salamanca had between 6,000 and 7,000 students. Its influence was immense. Francisco de Vitoria is often called the founder of the School of Salamanca. Some prefer the term Hispanic Scholastics. Vitoria belonged to the Dominican order and studied and taught at the Sorbonne, where he helped to edit a contemporary edition of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica and of the Summa of Saint Antonino of Florence. From 1522 to 1546, Vitoria taught at the University of Salamanca. Due to the many great scholars who passed through the university and their many works, the School of Salamanca has received more recognition than other universities. F.A. Hayek, the Nobel laureate, frequently recognized their scholarly work. Some credited a particular religious order, the Jesuits, for the market-oriented view of Catholics. Lord Acton wrote that the greater part of the liberal ideas of Milton, Locke, and Rousseau may be found in the works of the Salamanca Jesuits. Raymond de Roover, Marjorie Grice Hutchinson, Murray Rothbard, and Joseph Schumpeter recognized the major contributions of several religious orders at the School of Salamanca, not only the Jesuits. From the perspective of the free economy, the major contributions of the Hispanic scholastics were their focus on the human person as an individual being distinguished by its freedom. Their emphasis on the importance of private property for a peaceful, productive, and ethical social order, their conclusions about the importance of the right to trade, both nationally and internationally, the relevance of sound money, both as its role to preserve private property and to aid rather than hinder trade, their analyses equating the just price with market prices, devoid of fraud, monopoly, or coercion, their treatment of wages, profits, and rents as belonging to contracts, commutative justice, rather than distributive justice, which only dealt with justice in the provision and distribution of goods held in common by a family or a political body, and, finally, their careful distinction between legal and moral obligations and punishments. Among the Hispanic late scholastics, we should mention Domingo de Soto, Luis de Molina, Juan de Mariana, and Francisco Suarez. They all presented arguments that served as the foundation of a market order based on freedom and property. Vitoria and his entire school stated very clearly that all rights were natural and the consequence of God's law, not living in God's grace. Vitoria described 4 different aspects of law: eternal, natural, positive, and international, or jus gentium. Vitoria developed even further some views hinted in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, and stressed that the authority to exercise power comes from the community, usually through the operations of its legislative power. Vitoria's views on the origin of rights led to the conclusion that sin did not diminish one's right to private property. The scholars from Salamanca argued that private property is used more responsibly than common property, and that the human person, rather than nature, should be the guiding focus of their questions. Everything was created by God, and everything is, in that sense, good. But there is an order in creation, and in that order, the human person has domain over the land, the seas, and also the stars. Late scholastics were not economic liberals or libertarians in the modern sense. They believed that economic liberty, to be enjoyed by all, needed an order, and that order needed to be based on the respect of human nature. Their deep, rational analysis, made to complement what they learned by grace and revelation, can be taken in anti-liberal directions. But, as Hayek and Rothbard noted, it can also provide the basis for true liberty.
Pessoal, é um enorme prazer eu introduzir o nosso caro amigo Alex Chafuen. O Alex é difícil de descrever porque ele é uma das maiores figuras do liberalismo do mundo, e não só do liberalismo, porque ele toca em vários aspectos do conhecimento, inclusive teologia, ética, geopolítica, sobre as quais ele escreve, inclusive, em jornais importantes dos Estados Unidos. O Alex, ele presidiu a Atlas Foundation durante quase 20 anos, se eu não me engano. Agora ele está com o Instituto Acton, que é parceiro do Instituto Mises Brasil, parceiro do Centro de Liberdade Econômica do Mackenzie. O Alex está lançando um livro que vocês devem ter visto lá fora, que é o Fé e Liberdade, que acabou de sair do forno da impressora e que foi elogiado pelo Murray Rothbard, esse livro, e também pelo Antônio Cabreira, que escreve aqui na contracapa. Então, além de tudo isso, o Alex é um grande amigo meu e eu sempre colho os seus conselhos e conhecimentos com muito prazer. Então, é um enorme prazer apresentar Alex Chafuen.
Thank you so much, Elio, and all of you for being here. Elio knows I regard him as one of the great giants of economic freedom and human liberty. So thank you, Elio, for what you have done for Brazil. And now for the rest of the Americas, because I have confidence that what is going on in Brazil can really help change America for the good. But we have many challenges. And today I'm here to summarize like 300 pages in 25 minutes. That's what I have left. So we have some room for questions. And I will tell you a little bit about my how I started studying this. I went to the university, Catholic University of Argentina, at the time where the communists were almost taking over the country. We even had a terrorist cell in the monastery that served as our campus. And so I already had created a libertarian organization when I was around 2021. It's called Círculo de la Libertad. When I went to attend the senior year course on the history of economic thought, which was taught by a professor who has studied in Austria, in Innsbruck, his doctorate. His name was Oreste Popescu, a Romanian. And again, I was already sort of activist. And he started discussing the first day of class. We were only 20 people, more or less. He says, look, this is what we are going to study during the entire year. He says, we are going to start by the Greeks. Then we are going to do the Romans, Cicero, Seneca, a little bit of Augustine, then Aquinas, then the mercantilists, then the physiocrats, and then he says, with luck, we are going to study Adam Smith. I was one of the typical classical liberals who thought that Adam Smith was the founder of economics, and I'm very proud of Adam Smith so much that I wear him in my tie almost each day of my life. So I cracked a big laughter, like, ha! Again, but we were so, a nasty laugh, and with his heavy Romanian accent, like Count Dracula, he says, Mr. Chafuen, ¿de qué se ríe usted? What are you laughing about? I said, well, is this a conspiracy, against the free market, against teaching us, the values of the free market and the free economy, the champions of the free economy? And he said, look, by the next class, you have to do a paper as punishment. And the paper was about a work by Hesiod, a Greek author, who wrote a book called The Work and Days. Another person who wrote about economics was Xenophon. So look, that changed my life. Because I read that book, and in it I found many insights that were tremendously valuable for my beloved Austrian school of economics, like the theory of value. So that was my initiation. Long story short, I became such a good friend of the professor that then he immediately hired me to be assistant professor and a key researcher in his project. He was very respectful to the culture that hosted him. In this case, the Catholic University. He was Romanian. He had to escape Europe. He had lived in Colombia and worked at the United Nations. But in Latin America, he said, we are Latin American, and in the Catholic University, we have to study the origins of economic thought in Latin America. So we did. And who were the first Spaniards, who arrived to Latin America? Were the priests of the Dominican order that came to the island of La Española. This is the island that is shared today by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The most famous writings, I think, ever that came from there was a sermon that Fray Antonio de Montesinos gave November 30 of 1511. In that sermon, he was defending the rights of the Indians. And he quoted the famous passage of the Bible of St. John the Baptist, speaking about ego vox clamantis in deserto. He says, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, clear the way for the Lord's coming, as the prophet Isaiah said. This writing had great influence on Francisco de Vitoria. Francisco de Vitoria became the most famous defender of human rights by saying what the video says, that sinners have rights, both the Pope and the indigenous people, because the popes were regarded as sinners. And some of our Protestant brothers, were trying to say, well, they don't have the right for property. But the admiration is such that if you go to the United Nations building or to the Organization of American States, you will see the only statue in the United Nations is Francisco de Vitoria, and one of the key busts is in the OAS is that of Vitoria. His contributions were essential for the development, for the rule of law, that now we have learned that is essential for a free economy as well. But going to economics, what were the best first writings of these people? Well, the first writings were demanding an end to protectionism and mercantilism for Seville, because the priest and the people in the domain La Española had to ask permission to Seville and send the goods to Seville in order to trade with their neighbors in Yucatan, in Mexico. So this is the first writings. It's a plea for free trade. Let me go now to and see if I can manage to work this. Ouch. We say power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You say PowerPoint sometimes corrupt absolutely. Let's see someone. Well, I will do this because I do not know how to put it in big screen. If someone can come and help. Let's start with St. Augustine, who wrote very little on economics, but what he wrote was repeated by almost all the great Christian champions, especially on private property and theory of value. But he also, regarding businessmen, he had this famous phrase that almost all repeated, the vices are of the businessman himself, not of business in general. It's not business that is evil. It is people who is the business like any other person, like the government, they are the people who are evil. Now, Aquinas wrote much later, and he wrote more of economics, thank you so much, than Saint Augustine. And he basically was one of the first to start speaking possibly about commercial activities. Commercial activities were useful for the conservation and storage of goods, for the importation of useful goods that are necessary for the republic, also for the transportation of useful goods from places where they are abundant to places where they are scarce. Very important for him was private property, which the first concern was that it would be consistent with the scriptures. And many of the critics in the Christian world about private property and becoming rich with private property, they used to quote St. Luke 18:22-26. That's the passage when the rich young man approaches Jesus, who's God, and Jesus tells him to behave well, to do all these virtuous things, and he said, well, I have done all those from my youth. But then he said, well, one more thing, sell everything, and follow me. And he got sad because he was not ready to do that. And then Christ says, well, it's more difficult, for a rich person, to get to heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And that's it. Well, you see, you cannot be rich. And all these saints and commentators say, no, that's not what we mean. Because if you go to St. Luke 14:26, he says that those who do not hate father and mother cannot get into heaven. And there is a commandment, honor father and mother. What Jesus and the Christian world condemns is being attached to wealth. One of my favorite saints is St. Francis of Sales. And St. Francis used to say that the great joy of the Christian is being poor in the heart and rich in reality, in effect, because then he can have the glory in both worlds. And he says, like the pharmacist who can have poison in the pharmacy without being poisoned, the same person can have wealth and reach heaven. So once they were sure that it was consistent with the scriptures, they started focusing mostly only on logical arguments, why private property was good, why free trade was an important value, why you shouldn't create money and inflate the currency. St. Augustine sometimes is mentioned by some, he was more, for more collectivism. But in his book on the heretics, in point 40, Augustine condemns those who say that we have to live like the first apostles without marrying and without having wealth. That's actually a point that is regarded as a heresy by Augustine, and that is repeated by almost all the authors that I mentioned in the book. What were the reasons, that they gave? So that's what I just mentioned, about Aquinas and Augustine. The three basic reasons are that we take much better of the things that are owned in private. When we see with many people, like many officials are involved, the property tends to be wasted. Human affairs are more efficiently organized with private property, and it would be chaos, if everyone would decide about a particular piece of property. And the third one is very important, which is it leads to more peaceful societies. I think when you measure this with today's indices of economic freedom and respect for private property, it shows that Aristotle and Aquinas and the Scholastics were completely right. Again, quarrels and dispute do not disappear with private property, but they are much less than when there is confusion about who owns what. There's a saying in English, good fences make good neighbors, and I think it can be applied to this. The other important topic that Aquinas and Augustine wrote, but Augustine was the first to mention it, is that things in economics are not valued by their nature. They're valued by their usefulness to human person, and that use tends to be subjective. And one of the examples they gave is like a mouse. A mouse has animal soul, corn has vegetable soul. Theoretically, animal soul is higher than vegetable soul, but in this case, it reduces value because of the farmer because it eats their corn. Some of you do pesquisas, in research. Perhaps mice can add value in some areas. The example that Augustine used was that a horse sometimes is sold for more value than a human person. And again, almost everyone repeated this to make the point that value is subjective. What determined value? The originator of this is a Franciscan priest called Jean-Pierre Olivier, French, who lived soon after St. Francis of Assisi. And he basically divided what determines value into scarcity, into subjective value, desirability, and objective value in use. Objective value in use means, all things being equal, a better horse, faster horse, stronger horse would be valued more than a horse that is about to die. But again, depending on the circumstances, if the city would be surrounded by enemies, and there is a major siege in the city, and people are dying of hunger, a fat, heavy horse might be more valuable than a thinner, leaner horse. This view of value influenced the idea of just price. Just price had nothing to do with a metaphysical definition or a mathematical price. It basically was based on what supply and demand measured by common estimation, which is a word that St. Albert the Great, the teacher, the great scientist, teacher of Aquinas, and then all the scholastics defined the free market, the just price as the market that is arrived at through common estimation, without fraud, without monopoly, and without coercion. And again, like the Austrian economists, they said, any exchange should be for the mutual benefit of both parties, with the result that they are better off than previously. Hayek loved this quote, that the just price of things is not fixed with mathematical precision. Hayek knew more the Jesuits than other late scholastics. Other questions that Aquinas addressed, profits from trade, money is a medium of exchange, the topic of interest rates, and the topic of distributive justice, which had nothing to do with the distributive justice of today. This was one of the topics that Aquinas studied, and everyone also commented on it. He presented the case, a merchant is selling goods, but he knows that a big fleet is coming from the sea to sell the same good, and the price is going to go down. So people ask him, hey, am I sinning by not telling those who are buying that the price will drop in the future? And he said, no, they're not sinning, because knowledge has value. No, you cannot take advantage of certain lack of knowledge. You cannot trade with a baby and with a young person, and trade the house that he inherited for a few coins. But knowledge in economics has value. So that was a case that it was very important to legitimize trade in the eyes of the Christians. Let me go back now to one of my favorite saints and the late scholastics. This is St. Bernard of Siena, in a beautiful city, like 1 hour from Florence. And I will tell you, not only he repeated the academic discussions of Aristotle and Aquinas, but he was one of the best givers of homilies and sermons, and he gave them in Italian. And to make the case of private property, he basically discussed the idea of there are 3 towns, that created the first donkey share business, like Uber share or car share. He said, look, we don't need this donkey each day. Let's buy a donkey with the other municipalities and towns, and then we will share. What happened? Well, the first day, they load the donkey with grain, to take it to the neighborhood mill, and he loads it big, so he arrives, he does the mill, puts the corn where it belongs, and then the other grains. Then he goes back to the stable and goes happy to the house. Well, the government helped me with this subsidy of a free donkey. But when he's getting to home, he says, wow, I forgot to feed the donkey. Oh, well, someone must have fed him yesterday, and tomorrow someone is going to use it. Well, comes the second day, the guy from the other town comes, does the same thing with the poor donkey, and the donkey is not very strong, doesn't move very fast. So I said, wow, what donkey this municipality bought. Well, the government people are not very known for buying the best things at the best price, so it's free. So he used it, and you might guess where it goes. He used it all day. He leaves it in the stable, goes to his house, says, I did not feed it. Well, but yesterday someone fed it, and tomorrow someone's going to feed it. Well, the third day was awful. The poor donkey would not go forward, would not go backwards, no matter how much they used the whip to make it go forward. So St. Bernardine saying to the public, in the square, says, guess how the poor donkey finishes it. In the fourth day, he was slaughtered and eaten for his meat. There is a saying in Spanish, he says, asno de muchos lobos termina comido. A donkey owned by many wolves ends up being eaten. Again, so through popular stories like this, through academic works of jurists, of moralists, slowly people started defending these essential principles of the society. And here's perhaps what I told you, the making the practice of charity possible, it's key. And Francisco Vitoria mentioned, doing charity with what belongs to other persons is very easy. Feeding the hungry, giving lodging to the homeless, and close to the naked. You have to do it with your own. And only if you have property, you can practice through charity. The topic of profit is essential. Again, they love to contrast views, and Duns Scotus, and I commend Mises Institute because they published the entire part of this book. Duns Scotus was another Franciscan who wrote before St. Bernardine, who thought businessmen were so important. This is a Franciscan, by the way. Making vow for. So important that they had, the prince should see that they would always cover their costs. And all the other scholastics said, no, that's crazy. Then they were being efficient. The rich will always be richer. So they said, no, you can earn 300%, St. Bernardine is saying. But if you lose, you cannot go begging to the government. You have to be responsible for your business practice. Money is where they were some of the great experts, and some of the first treatises on economics that were purely economics were the one by Oresme on money. Copernicus, not only he was a scientist, he had a doctor in canon law of the University of Bologna, which is the oldest one in Europe, and wrote a treatise on money where he says that inflation is, people don't see it because it's a hidden process. Now it's more hidden, like Fernando Ulrich explained. When it was gold, you could see that the gold was not looking, they were putting more copper into the coin. So it was easier to blame the government for inflation. Paris was another university that was very influential where Francisco de Vitoria studied, and this is the famous University of Salamanca that was so important that even the English and the Irish sent their priests to be trained and their bishops, the future bishops, to be trained in Salamanca. It had between 6,000 and 7,000 students. And Francisco de Vitoria was the leading person. There's another university called Alcalá de Henares. Now it's divided into the Universidad Complutense and the University of Alcalá. In Portugal, you had Coimbra, and not only had Luis de Molina there, you have a father called Rodrigo do Porto. Martín de Pilcueta also taught at Coimbra. The College of Rome was like the best public policy think tank of the time, and you had both Francisco Suarez, Juan de Mariana, and Bellarmine teaching there. Then this is one of my favorite figures in the history of thought, Juan de Mariana. His book on money that also Mises published in his journal. Read it, because perhaps it's not as good as Larry White and Fernando Schuller, but again, it doesn't use graphs and mathematics, but it's a clear exposition of everything that goes into the supply and demand for money. The relevant contributions to the free economy, to summarize what was in that video, again, they're focused on the human person, as the key, of all analysis, distinguished by its freedom, its social inclination, and spiritual component. The importance of private property for a more peaceful, productive, and ethical order. Their conclusion about the importance of right to free trade, both national and international. Sorry, I went too fast. The relevance both of sound money, both for the need to preserve the private property of the people and the stability of its value. Their analysis where they equate the just price to the market price. The treatment of wages, profits, and rents as belonging to law of contracts, not distributive justice. That is just how you assess taxes, nothing to do with wages. And then finally, the difference between legal and moral obligations. They were convinced, and Aquinas too, that sin, just because something is a sin, you don't have to have a law to punish it. No, the Christian things, and vice versa. You don't have a law to promote everything that's good. That was essential in their analysis. Again, people don't mention, this is another Dominican priest who calls Vittoria like the father of neoliberalism. So much that Pufendorf, who was an author that Adam Smith quotes 26 times in his books in lectures of jurisprudence, that some of his Protestant authors criticized Vittoria for being too libertarian. No, you cannot allow market free trade in some of these things. I don't have time to speak about wages and other topics. Again, you can read the book and you find an extensive chapter on each of these issues. And let me finish with the difference with Austrian economics and with the libertarians. With Austrian economics, there's less difference if we regard Austrian economics as non-normative, as a non-normative science, not that decide what's good, but what's bad, if not what's true, and what you can deduce in a way that Austrian too is a positive science in that way that it's not a normative science. And interest rates, no, they condemned it. For them, usury, pure interest rate was a sin. They found excuses for it, but as the Muslims continue to ban it until today, it only changed in the church in the late 19th century. They had an insufficient understanding of the role of prices as indicators. Hayek really improved on that. With libertarians, I think there are more differences. They had the teachings on extreme need. Basically, in extreme need, things become, you can use something, you don't become the owner. If someone is coming there to rape you, and there is a bicycle or a horse of your neighbor, you are allowed to take the horse. It doesn't make you the owner of the horse, and if you can return it. The limits on the just price, they only allowed a 50% deviation from the average price. I think a libertarian would say anything that goes, anything goes. Their teachings on morality, obviously, they wrote much more against sins. The sodomy was big in many of the sermons of St. Bernard and of Siena, so they are not libertarians in the moral side. And some aspects of their just war theories. I know some of my good friends in the libertarian movement. So let me finish with a call for you to become the scholastics of the 21st century. I honestly believe that there cannot be contradictions between science and the truth about the true creator. But the best thing you can do, because faith is not reason, is to be the best scientist you can. To my libertarian friends, I recommend them, do not alienate people like me. I fell in love with liberty before. I was a big Randian. Then, by grace, I started believing in God. And then I realized, hey, they were the same thing. I'm not the only one who feels like that. So don't alienate some of us, because I think we should be allies. And what you have done here at Mackenzie, and what Mises Institute and Elliot with his generation has done, is putting in practice what I think we should be doing to win the battle for freedom. So, muito obrigado. Thank you. Boa noite a todos.
Alô, esse está funcionando. Bem, já que o tema é fé e liberdade, uma coisa importante que se ensina na doutrina católica é que mentira é pecado. Então, os que falaram lindo, procurem um confessor depois. Bem, é um prazer muito grande estar aqui essa noite com o Alejandro Chafuen, um amigo de longa data. A gente estava viajando juntos em Brasília essa semana e lembramos que nós nos conhecemos já desde 2001. Então, é uma trajetória, eu acho que alguns até que estão aqui nessa audiência, nem nascidos nessa época eram. Então, e o trabalho do Chafuen é muito importante nesse entendimento da escolástica, porque é uma pesquisa que nos mostra a base fundamental desse entendimento correto da ciência econômica. Então, como esses teólogos, juristas, moralistas, filósofos entenderam a economia. E eu estou recebendo aqui já algumas perguntas da audiência e quero passar para o Alejandro responder. Temos aqui, vamos lá. A primeira pergunta é do Wanderson. He said, "My name is Wanderson. You say in your book that Thomas Aquinas was scholastic per excellence. He lived almost 3 centuries before the Protestant Reformation, initiated by Luther and much propagated by the influential of John Calvin in Switzerland. Have you studied and found any resemblance in the economic thinking of the reformers to today's liberalism? Protestant reformers and liberalism have something in common?"
In theology, I mentioned one dispute, the one about human rights. We have to remember that this was not the age of a lot of tolerance. And it was when St. Bernardine and St. Antoine lived, the Medicis in Italy, were tremendously corrupt. There were tremendous problems in the church. Now I believe there is common understanding, and even some Protestant traditions believe that people in sin also have human rights. It is a very difficult topic about free will, and another topic is called nominalism. The only philosophers here would understand, but basically, there's a most orthodox follower of Aquinas in the late scholastic school was Domingo de Bañez. Domingo de Bañez was a Dominican who was the confessor of Santa Teresa. And his ideas on predestination, were very, very strong. Luis de Molina, who is a Jesuit who some people attack for being nominalist, he, like some Austrians, that words can never capture the essence of things. And my brother thought that was very dangerous. They had a battle for years and in decades between them, the same scholastics, criticizing each other, of heresy. And the Vatican said, both things are allowed. Stop fighting. Both theories can be taught. By the way, I went to a Presbyterian high school, St. Andrew Scott School, and I'm on the board of a Presbyterian college. So I'm very, very happy with the degree of tolerance and understanding and how we are reading each other, how Acton Liberty Fund has been studying and producing books of natural law from the Protestant tradition, and Acton devotes the same amount of time to study Protestant traditions than the Roman Catholic. So there are still differences, but there's a nice collegial attitude in the studies and how we use these fountains of knowledge in our traditions.
in what measure we can trace the influence of the Scholastics in the earlier Austrians, such Bombawerk, Friedrich von Wieser, and Ludwig von Mises, or this influence is better measured only in the works of Hayek and Rothbard, and also I'll add the name of Menger in this question.
Yeah, and then even it's so difficult to study these things. You know, how, imagine the age of intolerance, if a Catholic would speak well about a Protestant, you know, he would be burned perhaps, you know, and for a Protestant was the same. So I mentioned Pufendorf there, and then Grotius is another famous, who Grotius mentioned sometimes the late scholastics, and he's also called by some the father of international law. But you could see passages that are very similar, but they will not quote for each other because it was dangerous. Bellarmine wrote a criticism of Protestants, but it was so accurate that the Protestant started to use his book as a textbook. So he became a suspect. He was not canonized for like three centuries. So in this case, I believe that culturally, they influence part of the Austrians. In Menger is where I see a more similar epistemology. Both, by the way, I spoke about the things that are different. The Austrians and the late scholastic always started with a person. The analysis of economics started with human action. And the books of the great Austrians, you know, Human Action, Road to Serfdom, Man, Economy, and State. The human being is at the center. They didn't even speak in averages. Imagine this, they started doing this because people were coming to confess, and the demand for confession led to this. This is a brilliant paper by an academic paper by Clara Jace at George Mason University, which recently appeared, and he basically used a supply and demand analysis to explain the rise of the late scholastics. So the answer is, I think that Hayek found some similarities in the price theory, you know, how it results from estimación común and spontaneous orders were very similar.
There is a question here.
And I know that we love to have a stronger connection. Jesus Huerta de Soto tries to find, you know, even stronger connections, but it's difficult. I think the influence was culturally and the view on the human person.
Why can we say that real property is natural right instead of human invention?
Good point. That was done just by strategy. The first social encyclica was Rerum Novarum, 1891, by Leo XIII. This was the time the socialists were growing, and people were saying, yeah, because what he just said was the common doctrine, that Alejandro Chafuen has this suit and this pin doesn't mean that God gave them to me and natural right. I bought the suit, but I could give it to him, or so there's nothing, it's not in nature that this happens. And in nature, if people want to live in having things in common, they can. So the reason I have this code is because positive law says I paid for it, and the contract law says it's mine. But then Matteo Liberatore was a priest that Mario Rothbard liked, and later in his Jesuit started to write and study economics, and he was behind that encyclica. And he has in his book saying, as all the socialists and populists are saying, as property is by human law, let's abolish it and let's distribute it and change and create socialism. So it was explicit that they did it almost as an argument. Private property is consistent with natural law, not of natural law. The paradox that when private property was considered necessary because for an utilitarian reason, the social function of private property is because goods are good used better, private property was more respected than when it's considered by as natural law and everyone violates, for a while, everyone violated private property. By the way, it's one of the indicators that is not improving in the world. The respect for rule of law and private property has been stagnant or declining in the last decade. That's very problematic.
Before read the next question from the audience, I remember here my time working with you at Atlas Foundation in 2002, and we used to have a weekly debate group of the Italian authors of 19th century. And you have a long paper about this. I hope publish this in future by our publishing company. And you show in this new study of this 19th century authors a clear connection between the scholastics, the Spanish scholastics especially, and these Italian authors, and through these Italian authors, we can trace a better line between, in one side, the Austrian economics, and in the other side, the modern Catholic social teaching. Can you explain a little bit for the audience this importance?
Well, I don't know if we have time. There are three great authors. I mentioned Liberatore. There's another one called Antonio Rosmini, which the Jesuit got mad because he brought, all this beginning of the 19th century, like Bastian, he brought reason and rational thought and all type of philosophies into the debate at the same time that the Jesuits bringing back Aquinas. So some of these Jesuits say, the only guys who can like Rosmini are the atheists. I said, well, and as I was an atheist, and many of my friends are, I started giving them the book of Rosmini. And Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul, he rehabilitated Rosmini because he was put in the index, in the books that you should not read. In Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth about reason, he rehabilitated. And before leaving, he told the world, but he told Pope Benedict to try to canonize him. So the first step is regard him a blessed. So Pope Benedict, the first person he opened the road for sanctity was Rosmini. I say pray for many obvious miracles because I don't think, this Pope would canonize Rosmini. He was a great champion of private property. Property was like a sphere around the person. He wrote a wonderful book on social justice. And by the way, I think we might have to finish. It was a problem that Hayek did not read Latin languages well. Hayek blames on Taparelli d'Azeglio. Luigi Taparelli d'Azeglio wrote the most important book on natural law. And when he speaks about social justice, he speaks about the justice that is beyond courtroom, just the connections of actions and virtues that lead to a just society. So this thing that we are doing here is an exercise in social justice. It's such an equivocal concept that I tried to avoid it. But there is a long tradition that was also shared until the 1930s and 40s in Germany with the social market economists, the moralists that were with them, that the state has nothing to do, with social justice as a distributive agency. You only have to have good standards, good rule of law, equality before the law. So I recommend that you study, I think there was like a campaign on some of my friends, and Hayek really was annoyed, to hide that there's truth that come beyond reason. That's the main point that Hayek made. Every one of my friends believed the other Hayek, the spontaneous order. But there were two Hayeks, like there are two Adam Smith. One said everything is spontaneous order. But then in the first Montpellier Society, and he repeated this like every 10 years, he said, many libertarians, by alienating people that believe in tradition and religion, were throwing them into deep reactionary camps in which they don't feel totally comfortable. But if you don't give them room, they will go to those camps. So I think there is a lot of richness to bring these two worlds together. I think the Center here of Economic Liberty can play an enormous role in bringing together this two essential aspects of the human being, which is our reason, our nature as free beings, and also our spiritual life. We are more than chemicals, and I know that it's difficult to prove, but believe me, I wouldn't be here if I think that you were just a bunch of chemicals and there are no soul in you. So
I think your answer was great to address the next questions, How can we overly rational and scientific person deal with the lack of faith necessary to believe in God?
Let's see, lack of faith. I don't know if I understood. I am also a member of a foundation created by Sir John Templeton, and the CEO of Acton is in the most important board. And Sir John devoted all his fortune to try to encourage rational people to pay attention to spiritual reality. That's his dream. He was much more optimistic than me. He thinks that we used to, we used to start the board meeting with the slug, babosa. How you say, you slug, this thing that is not very good looking animal that is in the, well, he asked, what can you learn from that? The answer he wanted is that knowing about anything, an atom or the universe, if there is a God, it approximates to that. So I don't have, I wouldn't be calling it grace. I think it comes from God, and I think the best thing we can do is have good dialogue between scientists and people who believe that there's truth beyond pure reason. And that's the only thing that human beings have, but it's not certain that we will win in this earth.
Our time is over, but I think I put together, be short, two questions. One is, can a true Christian be a true anarcho-capitalist? And the second question, can you ask a little bit how your conversion starts?
Well, Walter Block of Mises Institute has a book where it says how I became a liberal, and I tell a little bit the story. That would be a little too long. I forgot to say, with anarcho-capitalism, I was a little more different. I was a little anarcho-capitalist, and that taxation is theft, I think would not be shared by the scholastic. When I was having my conversion, I always remember that I was a quasi-anarcho, I was like close to anarcho-capitalist. So I told the priest, again, and he said, fine. What I cannot do, depends. As a Catholic, is completely ignore the teachings, of the church. I have to make an effort, but I only have to obey them in matters of dogma, matters of faith, no matters of politics. Now, what belongs to the Caesar and what doesn't belong to the Caesar? The famous passage in the Gospels when they ask that question to Jesus Christ. So I think from the pure philosophical point of view, there could be problems in the applications, but I hope they become Christians, and I think I know a few. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much. I hope see you many times here in Brazil, especially in Mises events, in Mackenzie events. I think this partnership between Mises, Acton, and Mackenzie could be good for libertarians, conservatives, Catholics, Protestants, for all the Brazilians. Thank you so much.
Whatever.
And in the end, Alex will sign here the books. We still have... o Alejandro Chafuen vai depois assinar os livros dele, então, no pequeno intervalo, podem ir lá comprar, e teremos aqui depois, ao final, essa sessão de autógrafos. Muito obrigado a todos.
Thank you.